At his peak, one man in Colombia earned an estimated $420 million a week. Not a year, a week. And he still lost more money to rats than most countries spend on their entire army. His name was Pablo Escobar. But this is not really a story about one drug lord. It is a story about a ladder built entirely out of cash and the strange, brutal economics of a business too big for its own money to fit inside a bank. Because at every rank of the Medellin cartel there was a price, paid in cash, paid in blood, or paid in both. And behind every price, a life that rarely lasted long enough to spend it. Today we climb it, rung by rung. The runner, the sicario, the lieutenant, the enforcer, the boss. And then we open the books on the one thing that finally beat him. And it was not the police. This is rank and ledger. In today's episode, the Medellin cartel, rank by rank. What each level of Pablo Escobar's empire actually earned, what it cost them, and what finally brought down the richest criminal who ever lived. We start in the poorest hillside slums of Medellin, where a 12-year-old boy could already be earning cartel money. One thing before we climb. If you want to see who really gets paid in worlds like this, empires, armies, criminal syndicates, subscribe now and leave a like. It genuinely decides whether this channel survives. In the hillside, slums called the comunas, poverty was absolute, and opportunity was almost non-existent. Into that vacuum stepped the cartel, recruiting boys as young as 12 to run messages, watch corners, and carry small packages for cash that no honest job in the neighborhood could match. A runner might earn the equivalent of a week's honest wages for a single afternoon of watching a street corner. To a family with nothing, that math is not really a choice. It is survival with a very dark asterisk attached. And the cartel understood exactly what it was buying. Not just labor. Loyalty built early, before a boy had anywhere else to belong. By the time he was old enough to understand the cost, he was already inside. The cartel also quietly built genuine goodwill. Escobar funded football pitches, housing, and public lighting in neighborhoods the government had ignored for generations. To many families, he was simultaneously the reason their son carried a gun and the reason their street finally had electricity. Here is your first question, and answer it honestly in the comments below. In a neighborhood with no honest ladder to climb, is it fair to call that choice a crime? Or is it simply the only economy the world left available? Tell me below. Because the boy who says yes to that corner today is, without knowing it, one step from being handed a motorcycle and a gun. Climb one more rung, and the job stops being about watching corners. It starts being about ending lives. The sicarios were Escobar's hired killers, most of them teenagers or barely into their 20s, riding motorcycles through Medellin streets. Escobar openly offered a bounty of around $4,000 for every police officer killed. $4,000 in a city where the average worker might earn that in several years. A single afternoon's work for a teenage boy could be worth more than his father would ever see in his life. And the violence was never contained to Colombia alone. Car bombs, hijacked airliners, and assassinated politicians made the cartel's war a matter of open national trauma, one that a generation of Colombians grew up inside without ever choosing to. The most notorious of them, a man known only by a nickname, would later claim in his own words to have personally killed more than 100 people and to have ordered thousands more deaths. He called murder, in his own words, simply the job. And Escobar rewarded loyalty upward as fiercely as he punished betrayal. A sicario who survived long enough and proved himself could be pulled off the motorcycle entirely and given real territory to run. The single fastest promotion on this whole ladder. But the sicario's pay came with the shortest life expectancy on this entire ladder. Most who took this rung did not live long enough to climb another one. The cartel's own service simply consumed them, one generation of boys after another. The ones who survived long enough and proved useful enough moved up to running entire territories instead of single killings. A lieutenant managed a district, a route, or a processing operation and took a cut of everything that moved through it. Cocaine, cash, loyalty payments, all flowed upward, with a share sticking to his hands on the way. A single successful shipment, hundreds of kilos crossing safely into the United States, could earn a lieutenant more in one transaction than most professionals in Bogota would see across an entire career. He lived well. A comfortable house, a fast car, respect on the street that money alone could not have bought a year earlier. But he also lived one rumor away from either promotion or a bullet, and in this organization, both arrived without much warning. A lieutenant's wealth was always borrowed from tomorrow. Every peso he spent today assumed there would be a tomorrow at all. And in Escobar's Colombia, that was never a safe assumption to make. Escobar formalized this brutal middle management through what he called the Office of Envigado, a debt collection and enforcement operation that dispatched hired guns against anyone in the business who failed to pay what they owed. It functioned like a court, a bank, and an execution squad, all under one roof. If Escobar's organization was owed money, the office collected it one way or another, and there were only ever two ways. The genius of the office, if it can be called that, was its consistency. Debts were tracked as carefully as any legitimate business ledger, interest accrued, and collectors were dispatched on a schedule almost as reliable as a bank's. Terror? Run with the discipline of an accounting department. Plata o plomo, Escobar called it. Silver or lead. Take the bribe or take the bullet. It was the operating philosophy of the entire organization, stated as plainly as a company motto. Judges who ruled against the cartel were offered the same choice their debtors were. Journalists who investigated too closely received the same visit. The philosophy did not apply only to business rivals. It applied to the entire machinery of a country that was supposed to be able to stop him. Here is your second question for the comments. If every business transaction came with a genuine standing choice between a bribe and a bullet, would you have taken the money every single time, no matter who was asking? Tell me below. Above the men making that choice sat the ones trusted with something far more valuable than money, Escobar's own life. Above the lieutenants stood the men who did not just enforce Escobar's will. They were trusted with his life. The chief enforcer ran Escobar's personal security and his most sensitive operations. He was paid a substantial monthly retainer, plus bonuses for specific jobs, plus a share of whatever territory he personally protected. He lived like a wealthy businessman, with houses, cars, and a wardrobe far beyond anything his upbringing had promised him. And he carried a burden none of the money could lift. Everyone who ever tried to reach Escobar had to go through him first, which made him, at all times, the second most hunted man in the country. And if you think that fear was the worst of it, wait until you see what actually destroyed this fortune, because it was not the police, and it was not a rival. Remember that promise from the very start. He rarely slept in the same house 2 nights running. Every meal could theoretically be his last free one. Wealth at this rank had not bought safety. It had simply bought a more expensive, more anxious version of hiding. Above him at the very top sat the one man in Colombia rich enough to buy his way onto the same list as the world's legitimate billionaires. Now we reach the top of the fighting ladder. The man they called El Patron. At his absolute peak, Pablo Escobar's organization is estimated to have earned around $420 million in a single week. His personal fortune has been estimated at as much as $30 billion. To put that in perspective, at his peak, Escobar's personal wealth rivaled the entire gross domestic product of a small nation, accumulated by one family in 1 decade, entirely outside any bank, any stock exchange, any tax authority on earth. For 7 consecutive years, Forbes magazine listed him among the wealthiest people alive on earth, in the same pages as legitimate billionaire industrialists and inventors. A cocaine trafficker, ranked beside the men who built televisions and oil empires. He was even, for a period, elected as an alternate member of the Colombian Congress, using a foundation that built homes for the poor as his political base. A drug lord with a seat, however briefly, inside the very government he was simultaneously corrupting and terrorizing. That double life could not hold. Once his politics and his cartel's violence became impossible to separate in the public eye, the legitimacy he had briefly bought became the very thing that made him too dangerous for anyone in power to protect any longer. Pause the video here and guess. With that much cash flooding in every single week and nowhere legal to deposit it, what percentage of Escobar's entire fortune do you think was simply lost every single year before it was ever spent? Type your guess in the comments. I will wait. Locked in your guess? Because the true twist of this entire ladder is not who Escobar defeated. It is what quietly defeated him every single year without anyone lifting a weapon at all. Here is your answer. According to his own brother, roughly 10% of Escobar's entire fortune was written off every single year. An estimated $2.1 billion simply gone. Not stolen by police, not seized by the government. It rotted in damp underground hiding places. It was gnawed apart by rats who could not tell a $100 bill from a nest of paper. It was buried in fields and simply forgotten. The map to it lost along with the man who buried it. Some of it was simply spent badly. Escobar was known to pay outrageous, deliberately excessive prices, buying loyalty and legend in equal measure, importing exotic animals for a private zoo, building a bull ring, a runway, and a full-size replica of the car that made Bonnie and Clyde famous. None of that spending was really about comfort. It was about legend. A man that visibly untouchable, that visibly rich, was harder for his own soldiers to imagine ever losing to. The excess was armor, worn in plain sight. This is the strange curse of a fortune too large and too illegal to bank. Every legitimate billionaire on that same Forbes list could put his money to work earning interest, building companies, compounding quietly for decades. Escobar's money could only ever hide, and hidden money rots. Of course, in every other telling of this story, the ending is a manhunt. By the early 1990s, a vigilante group calling itself Los Pepes, made up partly of Escobar's own enemies within the drug trade, began systematically hunting down his associates and allies one by one. That hunt combined an elite Colombian police unit, quiet American intelligence support, and Los Pepes itself. Three forces agreeing on almost nothing, except that Escobar had to fall. In December 1993, they finally found him, on a rooftop in his home city, and the chase ended there. But notice what that story leaves out. By the time that manhunt finally closed in, the money had already been quietly bleeding out for years, rotting in the ground faster than any bullet could have taken it. The manhunt did not defeat the fortune was already defeating itself. And when Escobar finally fell, the empire he built did not vanish with him. A quieter, more businesslike cartel from the city of Cali quickly absorbed much of the trade he left behind, proving the latter itself had never truly needed him. It only ever needed the business. And in the end, it was not a rival cartel, and not a single bullet that truly broke the empire. It was the same problem multiplied by every single year he stayed in business. An empire built entirely on cash was, by its very nature, an empire built on a fortune that could never stop leaking. So here is the final ledger of the Medellin cartel. The runner traded his childhood for a wage no honest job could match. The sicario traded his life expectancy for $4,000 a bounty, and rarely lived to spend much of it. The lieutenant and the enforcer lived like kings, one rumor away from a bullet. The boss became one of the richest men who ever lived, and lost more money to rats and rot every year than most nations collect in taxes. In the end, the ledger of the Medellin cartel does not really end with a rival, or even with the manhunt that finally caught him. It ends with a simple, almost boring truth. Money this size, kept entirely outside the law, cannot actually be kept at all. So here is your last question, and it is the one that matters most. If 10% of your fortune rotted away every single year, no matter what you did, would the number on paper even mean anything to you anymore? Tell me below. I read every comment. Next time on Rank and Ledger, we climb one of two ladders and you decide which. The CIA or a hedge fund? Vote in the comments. And if this story held you, do the two things that keep this channel climbing. Leave a like and subscribe. The ladder continues.